Hello and welcome to Beyond Organic Wine. I'm Adam Huss coming to you from California. Thank you so much for listening. And just a reminder, I started a Google group for all of us who want to crowdsource quick information, or I don't know how quick, but deep information from a pool of people from around the planet who are all involved in this regenerative agricultural winemaking thing that we're talking about on this podcast and asking questions about. So if you would like to participate in that, and I would love you to participate in that, it's a great way to share knowledge, get knowledge, and just, hear a bunch of solutions to things. There's been some really great examples of that already in the past couple of weeks. Go to your Google groups, or sign into Google. Go to Google Groups, search for Beyond Organic Wine, all one word, just Beyond Organic Wine, and ask to join, and I will connect you to everybody in the group. Now, it has come to my attention that regardless of how we define wine, wine is not wine. Wine is a gift. Wine is love. Wine reminds us with every succulent sip that a process of decay and corruption can be transformed into liquid poetry. Wine is the magical inextricability of life intertwined with death. It transforms the mundane material of the universe into beauty, into joy, and into flavors that, at least for a little while, hold death in an embrace of gratitude and give us a kiss that makes time stand still. Wine is not wine. It is our sensual reminder to not take all of this for granted. The simple, clean air, the fresh water, the shade sparkled by the wind in the tree, the largesse of daily life, all the mundane things we overlook every moment of the day. They are miracles, magic, magnificence embodied, more valuable than anything we can buy with all the money in the world. And the only way they can truly be valued is for us to awaken, open our eyes, and see how infinitely precious they are. Astronauts and civilians who have had the rare opportunity to see Earth from space do not come back to Earth the same people. The perspective shift they gain from seeing our home surrounded by the immense emptiness of space can be very emotional, with feelings ranging from deep sadness to ecstatic wonder to transcendent connection. It's so common a psychological phenomenon that it has been named the overview effect. Some of the words that astronauts from multiple nations have used to describe the Earth from this perspective include tiny, vulnerable, fragile, beautiful, a holy relic, a brilliant jewel, heaven, paradise, delicate, and, quote, a sparkling blue and white jewel, a light, delicate sky blue sphere laced with slowly swirling veils of white, rising gradually like a small pearl in a thick sea of black mystery, end quote. Karen Nyberg, a NASA astronaut, said, quote, every single part of the Earth reacts with every other part. It's one thing. Every little animal is important in that ecosystem. Seeing the Earth makes you realize that. It makes you want to be a little more proactive in keeping it that way, end quote. Vladimir Kovalyov, a Russian cosmonaut, said, quote, after an orange cloud formed as a result of a dust storm over the Sahara and caught up by air currents, reached the Philippines and settled there with rain, I understood that we are all sailing in the same boat, end quote. Wine is not wine. It is the true gratitude of this experience that is unique in the universe, as far as we know, of being alive. I think this perspective is important as a context for this episode with Esther Park. Esther leads Cienega Capital, a private investment company that invests in food and farming enterprises that are helping to build a regenerative food system. This episode is about the unique criteria and ways of investing that Cienega Capital uses, and why it shouldn't be so unique. If you are a regenerative farmer, or if you are helping to build a regenerative food system, and I think Esther would include wine in this, you may be very interested to hear what Esther looks for in a good investment and how you might become one. But everyone, whether you're looking for a regenerative investment or not, should hear the questions Esther asks of all of us. Money is not money, of course, and everything we do with it is symbolic. Our world is finite, fragile. It does not support the infinite growth of wealth. Nearly everything about us and our world has cycles that include both life and death. We live in a culture where we've mistaken money and wealth as the ends when they are merely means. I think about how I've traded so much of my time on this holy blue relic of a planet for money. Have I valued that exchange enough? Have I really understood what I was giving and what I was getting in return? Sometimes I'll make a wine that I can only give away because it took years to make, and I made so little. It's too valuable to sell. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes things are so precious they can only be given as gifts. That's why I started talking about this episode of regenerative investing with a meditation on the preciousness of Earth. Maybe this perspective can begin to reshape the way we think about these exchanges. Enjoy. Welcome. Thanks for doing this. And could you? I don't often do this in person. It's very strange for me. I'm going to try to make eye contact, but I might get lost.
It's okay.
I'm used to being totally in my head. Could you please introduce yourself and what you do?
Sure. So I'm Esther Park, and I lead Cienega Capital, which is a private investment company, and we invest in food and farming enterprises that are engaged in somehow in the regenerative food system. So we invest across the supply chain, from farms directly. About 30% of our portfolio is directly to farms and farmers. And then throughout the supply chain all the way to the end of like a consumer packaged good. So we have a handful of investments there. But we make investments in aggregators and distributors and processors and brands.
Yeah.
But I think for us, the true north is really about farmers and about helping farmers who are practicing regenerative farming. And so everybody that we finance through the supply chain has to have some pretty direct connection to the farmers that they're sourcing from. So that's what we look for because, I think anonymous supply chains are part of what gets us into the mess we're in, where people don't know where their food comes from. And also, a lot of those anonymous supply chains really favor like the corporate and industrial ag companies as opposed to the small farmers.
Right on.
Yeah.
How did you end up in this?
Good question. How far back do you want me to go?
Yeah, I'm fascinated. I'd love to hear your life story.
Yeah. Well, there's this funny thread where my father worked for the California Department of Food and Ag.
Okay.
But honestly, growing up, I didn't really pay attention too much to what he was doing because most of what he was doing was statistical quality control, which to a kid is not that interesting. But it has big implications for the food system and how it works, particularly on the regulatory side. But my first entry into this work really started to come from a place where I was really interested in small business, just generally. Small business as a driver of economic development. So I had been living in a former communist country, in the country of Uzbekistan.
Oh, wow.
And, at that time, this was in the mid-90s, they were transitioning from a communist economic structure to a capitalist economic structure. And in the process of that transition, there were lots of agencies, multilateral agencies that were bringing in grant money into the country to try to develop various aspects of their government, their society, their economy. But I felt like a lot of it was missing the mark because what was actually driving the change in the economy was small business, which didn't really exist as a thing under communism. Everything was state-owned, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at some of the statistics around countries that are capitalist societies like ours, up to 70% of GDP in this country and other countries are driven by small business.
Nice.
I think it's starting to become less so because we have so much like aggregation of these big companies, which is unfortunate, but historically that's been the major driver of our growth. And so to me, I felt like this is a sector which has not been paid attention to enough, and yet it's a key driver.
Yeah.
So I just got interested in how do we support and develop the small business sector.
Is that true for farming too, that it's like that level of small farms?
That's a good question. I don't know if I've ever seen any analysis around that, but that would be interesting.
Okay.
To see like how much small farms make up
Yeah.
The food
agricultural
economy.
pie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. Sorry, keep going.
No, so I just got interested in that in general, and then as I started working in small business finance, I really started getting interested in social enterprise. So what is the potential for business to do something good? You know, whether it's their sourcing strategy, you know, supply chain, or whether it's in the actual good that they make. So I started creeping into the food category through organic and fair trade.
Okay.
And this was around like 2005, 2006, when organic and fair trade was just starting to take off.
Yeah.
And the organization that I was with at the time, we just sort of hit the market at the right time, where we said, this is the market we want to serve. And there were lots of small companies who were entering the space, so it was perfect. And so we started growing some of these companies, and some of which are quite large now. So it was very rewarding from that perspective. And as a result of that, I started learning more about what is organic ag, and what is ag in general. I was with an organization where we learned about biodynamic farming, right? How many people know about that? I certainly had no idea about that before I started there. But we learned about it, and I thought, oh, this is really interesting. A way to like think about ag that like really aligns with the rhythms of the earth and of the universe.
Yeah.
So wow, there's this like spiritual dimension that we can add as well to farming. So that just started my interest in it. And then when I met Sally and started working with her, she told me, I'm just really interested in working with farmers.
Nice.
And I said, well, I've never done that before, but great, let's do it. And in a lot of ways, I have to say that farmers are very much like small business owners in developing countries, where, you know, all the receipts are in a shoebox, or like all the accounts are made on the back of a cigarette box, or, you know, it's a very cash flow based business.
Yeah.
And so there were a lot of similarities, actually.
Yeah.
So I thought, oh, well, this is actually something that I can take from my previous life and apply it here to this one. Yeah.
Did you know it was the 100-year anniversary of biodynamics this year?
Oh, I did not know that. That's exciting.
I mean, it's, theoretically, like it's when, whatever. It was, it's what is being celebrated is the 100-year anniversary. Could you describe who Sally is for those who may not know?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so Sally Calhoun is the single investor in Cienega Capital, and she is a rancher, an investor, a philanthropist. She and her husband were tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, sold their business at the height of the bubble in the early 2000s, and really started to think about what to do with their wealth. And one of the big things was to purchase and nurture and steward the Piscinas Ranch here in the Central Coast of California. So I think in the early days, Sally was really just focused on the land, perennial grasses, trying to figure out how livestock play a role in all of that, and really just managing the land for ecological value. But then somebody put a bug in her brain about, well, and what's your money doing? And I think she tried to put that off for quite a while, but started to find that it was actually a joy to provide financing to folks in the farming community.
So did she divest from like stock market?
Not completely.
Okay.
But all of the capital that goes into Cienega is funds that are divested from their regular market holdings.
Got it.
So in a way, it's a divestment strategy, but it wasn't like, we're taking X amount of dollars out of the stock market and we're going to put it into this fund. We just sort of funded as needed.
Right.
But we were always taking it from the public market stuff that they've invested in.
Gotcha, yeah. So in learning all these things, was your focus always on, like, what is your focus? Like investment analysis, or, I mean, it can be anything, I guess, but like, I mean, I guess that investment analysis part is the part I'd love to ask you about. So I'm curious how that developed for you and what your evolution in sort of developing your ideas about how you actually analyze investments and true values and things like that, and what is left out of much analysis. So
Yeah.
I'd love to hear how
Yeah.
you got that rabbit hole started for you.
Yeah. Well, so as I mentioned, it starts with cash flow based accounting, which is just sort of like, how does the cash flow operate in this business? And particularly with farms, they're highly seasonal, right? So in the early days when we were trying to structure loans for farmers, I realized that, actually what works is, give me one payment in July and give me one payment in October, because that kind of follows just the cash flow of a farm.
Right.
Don't make any payments to me in the winter when it's your, fallow season. So instead of trying to structure a monthly payment, it was just like, let's do it when you have the most cash, and let's not make any payments when you're very low on cash. So that was kind of just the basis initially. But also, as I worked with farmers, I think the whole idea of character-based lending really started to come into play, right? Because I think that farming comes with so many risks that you can't control, right? Weather, rain, fire, like there's all these sort of what you call acts of God that in the banking industry, they never want to deal with acts of God because you can't predict them, you can't control them. And so that's actually why a lot of banks don't like to work with farmers, because they can't understand those risks. And so for me, in engaging with the farmers, I realized that actually it's the like, looking them in the eye and them telling me, I will pay this back, and it may not happen on the schedule that we think it will, or maybe it will, I don't know. But just the commitment of the farmer to say, like, I respect the thing that you're helping me with enough to say, I'm going to pay you back. And it hopefully on time, and if not on time, eventually. And so, like, I take value in that, because I think more than any other population, farmers really put a lot of stake on their word. Yeah. And it's everything for them. And so I know that when they tell that to me and look me in the eye, that they're telling the truth. And so for me, I think that was just sort of the basis of like getting familiar with and comfortable with making loans to farmers. But if you extrapolate that, a lot of the companies that we invest in are fairly early stage. And so, even if they're not farmers, they're entrepreneurs. And what I'm really doing is making a bet on them. So I'll read their business plan, I'll look at it, it might be fine, it might it might seem like way too ambitious, or it might seem like off, not really on the right track. Right. And so I might have questions about the business plan, but I think at the end of the day, my investment decision is really about like, okay, but are you going to make this work? Like, even if it veers off the business plan, are you going to make this work? Are you going to be able to pivot when needed? Are you going to ask for advice if you feel stuck or don't know what to do? And so those are the kinds of things that I'm looking for, because ultimately, like, business plans are just paper. And most of the time, like, if you actually meet your business plan, it's a miracle. I almost count on you not meeting your business plan, because that's just the way life works. But what I'm really counting on is the entrepreneur's ability to be flexible, adaptable, and to figure things out.
Right on.
Yeah.
What in the plan, or I guess what I'm trying to ask is, do you mind digging into the analysis that you use for an investment? And and I'd love to know what you think is missing from traditional analysis, investment analysis. Like, are there ways that we should be evaluating investments? Like, I know that in regenerative ag, the time frames are very different, and some of the outcomes or the returns are not necessarily financial. So I'm curious how you think about that, and also how you evaluate that and analyze that.
So you could say that we're an impact first investor, which means that for me, if it doesn't have some kind of a matching impact to what we're looking for, I'm not really that interested.
What does that mean?
So for us, as I mentioned before, the target is really how it affects farmers at the end of the day. Like, does this benefit farmers? Because farmers need markets, and so everybody in the supply chain hopefully will be, helping that farmer access markets. And so if it doesn't match that criteria, I'm really not interested. So let's say somebody is trying to do, here's a good example because I see a lot of these, food waste.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So we're going to divert food waste and we're going to upcycle it into another thing, which I think is great. And I think there's a lot of validity to that business model, and there's definitely value to it from an impact perspective. But honestly, that doesn't impact farmers. And so from my perspective, that's not really something that I'm interested in financing, but that somebody else should, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, so it's not that it doesn't have value in itself, it just doesn't sort of match the kind of bullseye of impact that we're really looking for.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So to your point about the analysis, I think because we are impact first, we're a bit agnostic about the return.
Oh.
And in some cases, I feel like that really makes us the ideal investor for regenerative ag projects and companies because let's just take, for example, a grass-fed beef company. I can't imagine venture capital being interested in grass-fed beef. A, it's low margin. B, it's really tough to scale. C, what's the exit strategy there?
Right.
Because usually in venture capital, the exit strategy is to sell it to a larger company. But in grass-fed beef, who are you going to sell it to? And so those are the typical questions that a traditional investor might ask, whereas I'm really asking, how does this contribute to the regional food economy here? How can we help support this business? And how can we exit in a rational way that doesn't cause the business to do irrational things? Like grow exponentially without attention to the bottom line, or to sell to the largest bidder, whoever that might be, if anybody. Right? So it's more about how do we invest in a way that creates resilient businesses that will serve the local regional economy. And I think most investors are not interested in that because it doesn't make the financial return that they're looking for.
So what would be some exit strategies that you would look at? I mean, obviously, so assuming you're not going to be just selling a business for 100% profit or whatever, what is it? What does somebody think about?
So just to geek out a little bit, one of the structures that I really like is the redeemable preferred, which is, it's an equity investment that actually acts a little bit like debt. So I'll make the investment in you. Usually when you invest equity, the exit, like I said, is a sale of the company. Then somebody buys your shares and you go away.
Right.
It's easy, it's clean, that's why a lot of investors go for that. But in the case of some of these businesses, using a redeemable preferred is basically over 10 years, you're going to eventually give me my money back.
Oh.
So we can determine a schedule. Maybe for 5 years you don't make any payments, but then, in the last 5 years, you're going to figure out the business model, you're going to be a little more profitable, and you're going to be able to pay down, basically buy back your equity.
And does that mean that as the investor, you own less and less of the business?
That's right.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, in some cases. So there's different ways to structure it.
Okay.
Where, maybe we'll stay in for 80% of cash flows until we get our money back, and then we'll just stay in, but then, we just get a 50% of whatever dividends or whatever, 20% of dividends that are paid out by the company.
Gotcha.
And so since we've already got our money back, we don't really care. Anything else is just gravy.
Right.
And we'll just stay in.
Do you have people who come to you who know none of this language that you're using?
Absolutely.
And you are you able to work with them?
I am.
Okay.
And I have, I think a lot of investors have patience with entrepreneurs that don't necessarily know financial terms.
Yeah.
Because it's not the thing that they know, which is understandable.
Yeah.
So I take a lot of care in explaining, what this is, what it means, how it will play out. And in a couple of cases, like I've had to have several conversations about like, okay, so what if this, then what happens, right? And so just going through all the scenarios of like, you know, the implications, which is great because I feel like entrepreneurs should absolutely know exactly what money they're getting and why and how, right? How it's all going to play out.
Right.
So yeah, I'm happy to have as many conversations as needed to really just walk through and help folks understand.
Are there any specific criteria that you use besides impact? Like, are there any other, you know, is there like a list of things that like prioritize an investment for you?
I mean, they're pretty basic things.
Okay.
So one is it can't be like a pure startup in the sense that they have no sales.
Right. Got it.
If you're just starting out, you haven't sold anything yet, that's really hard.
Right.
And so I typically, you know, tell them like maybe there's some other financing that you can get from friends and family or something like that.
Right.
Come back to me in a year. You know, like I'd like to see at least 1 year of sales.
Right.
To just get a sense of like, okay, like I can see how you're operating this company. I can see what your sales strategy is, right? It's not just on paper.
Right.
So actually seeing it in action is important to me.
Right.
And then, yeah, I think one situation that I have sometimes found, which is a hard line no for me, is if there's negative gross margin.
Okay.
So gross margin is basically, right, your profit after your cost of making the thing that you make before overhead.
Oh, wow.
Right. So before you pay for rent.
So if you're already losing money before you've even paid your bills.
I mean, to me, I was like, that's not a business.
Right.
If you can't make money just making this product and selling it without attention to even just like, you know, overhead, rent or utilities or whatever it might be, this is not a business.
Right.
And so that's kind of where I draw a hard line. And so I have encountered businesses where they're making negative gross margin, and I said, you have to go fix that, and then when you do, come back.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
How do people operate like that? Do they just have a lot of money?
That's a very good question. I mean, sometimes they're just subsidizing it on their own.
Right.
So that is hard, and it's not a place where you can live for very long.
Right.
So, but yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes in, you know, let's say venture-backed companies, they can actually tolerate that for quite a while because if they get a lot of money, if you get a lot of capital, you can afford to bleed that for a while. And investors are just doing it on the faith that it's going to pencil out at some point. But I'm like, no. It has to pencil out before.
Wine is special. Do you do anything with wine?
We accidentally got into wine.
So beyond the vineyard here, is that?
So we actually don't do anything with the vineyard here directly at Cienega Capital. Although I've had conversations with the vineyard crews sometime, you know, at various times just about like how they're thinking about the economic model. Yeah. But we invested in a cider company.
Oh,
and they merged with a winery.
Right.
And so now we're in the winery. So it was accidental. We didn't intend on investing in a winery, but it just sort of happened.
Do you have any feelings about wine as an investment or vineyard operations or anything like that?
Yeah. I have to say I'm not super well versed in the wine industry in terms of, like, let's say manufacturing wine and then selling it and all the things that have to happen around that with the licensing and the shipping and the production and all of that. So I would say it's an area where I would need to get up to speed pretty quick if we were going to make a direct investment. Yeah. But I'm not averse to it because, you know, from what we've seen here at Piscinas Ranch, there's so much potential in terms of ecological value in how you're, you know, managing the vineyard. And so I think if we see more things like that, I would jump at the chance to, you know, make an investment or something like that, just to the degree that, you know, we're finding out, right? What are really the economics of doing it like that? Yeah. You know, how does that affect a business, a wine growing business, separate from winemaking, right? Because we don't make any wine here at the ranch. Yet, as some people like to say. Yeah. And so, yeah. And I have talked to a couple of the folks that make wine from here.
Yeah.
And some of them have financing needs.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in that as a way to just sort of help develop folks who are really committed to the sourcing in terms of regenerative grapes. And so, you know, they all happen to be in natural wines, as you know. But to the extent that I can help them, I would love to help them as part of the supply chain that comes out of the Paxinas Ranch. So yeah.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, well, you mentioned a bunch of things. How do you take into account ecological impact or things like that, or community impact or things like that? Like things that are non-monetary, and I don't know how you would even look at a spreadsheet for that, unless you're counting species and seeing biodiversity increases and things like that, but there's no monetary value to that. Like, how do you think about that, or how does that play into these kind of things?
It's a huge factor.
Oh, okay.
And it's actually one that we love. It's probably the thing we love more than the financial return is the impact value. And I will say that we are not about impact metrics. And part of the reason for that is that it's a very kind of one-dimensional approach to things, right? So I think in this society, we love the one-dimensional reductionist, like straight path from A to B kind of thing. And I think in the work that we do, we can't do that. Otherwise, we're going to do it at the exclusion of some amazing things that could potentially happen. So we look for people who are leaders in their community, who have the potential to have an effect on other companies, other communities, other regions, things like that. And I think that when we see that pay dividends in that kind of impact, we're super happy.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I can go out to somebody's field and I can say, you know, how many species do you have here today? Right? I'm not going to put them in a spreadsheet and count them. That's not what I'm going to do, because then, you know, I'm going to go for like, oh, well, this guy has 12 species in his, you know, field, but this guy only has 8, so I'm going to invest in this 12 one, you know, whereas the guy who's only got 8 in his field might be doing some really amazing things in his community.
Right.
So I think we really try to balance those things out where we love the impact, we encourage that impact to happen, but we don't put hard numbers around it because we like to see the emergence of what could be, right? Because oftentimes the most interesting impacts that come out of something are the things that you didn't ever think was going to be an impact, right?
Interesting.
So I've told the story about a farm that we made a loan to, and on the surface of it, it seems totally mundane. I mean, we did like a $30,000 loan for irrigation pipe.
Okay.
Like, that just sounds not that interesting, right? Very not sexy, but like they were in their second year of production and they needed irrigation pipe for their herb farm. Great. So we made the loan, but it turns out that the couple that was farming it, the wife was very instrumental in passing non-GMO legislation or anti-GMO legislation in her county.
Yeah.
And as a result of their success, she started consulting with other regions, municipalities, counties, and states about how they could pass similar legislation in their place. Yeah. And so the impact of that, right, for them to be able to get their farming operation going and going well without having to worry about like onerous or burdensome debt payments, you know, enabled them to be able to do this other work, right? And so that's super exciting. I never would have predicted that.
Right. That's very cool.
But it's awesome.
Yeah. You made me think of something. Have you ever seen there's sort of documentary series called Roots So Deep You Can See the Devil Down There?
No, that sounds interesting though.
Well, I mean, the question, I guess, is is it possible that you might partner with an organization who would do analysis, like ecological analysis? Like, I say that because what happened in this film was a documentary person who got a group of scientists together to start studying the impact of different grazing systems. Mm-hmm. And so they went and counted, but they sent these teams of scientists out to each farm, and they picked farms that were like side by side, one practicing regenerative, holistic, adaptive, management, and the other practicing a more conventional form of just put them all out to pasture and fertilize with nitrogen to make the pasture grow.
Right.
And so they had hard numbers then at the end of a year cycle of that or whatever, where they had like not only like birds and insects and soil health type stats, and infiltration and things like that, but they had like gases, like greenhouse gas emissions from each system and stuff like that. So I don't know. Just curious if that was something that you've seen or considered, if there's partnering that you might do.
Yeah. We have not sought out partners to do that. There are several groups who do that kind of monitoring. And I think one of our experiences with one of our investees was, they went down the path with a certain partner who could do that monitoring for them. And then just things started to really not work out. So then they had to switch to another group that was going to do that for them. And I think that, like, having one partner is going to be really hard because they might not mesh well or like do well with everybody in the portfolio. That said, I will say that the folks who are in our portfolio tend to already care about these things and are doing some level of monitoring on their own. Right. Yeah. And so whether it's with a partner organization or if they're doing it on their own, oftentimes they're excited to share that with me, Right. And we're also super careful not to impose additional work on an investee that's only going to benefit us.
Right.
So we don't do anything as a rule in that perspective. But, when somebody tells me, like, our water infiltration rate went from like 2 inches an hour to 6, I'm just like, awesome, and we celebrate that with them. And,
right.
And that's the kind of data that I'm like really happy to receive, but I'm not trying to aggregate it to like promote ourselves and like,
right.
Our farmers did X.
Right,
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Going back to the cidery, what I should have asked, any fermented beverages or like business things. So why cider?
So I know different people who are doing really good social investment in different ways. And there's somebody that I know in Vermont who has a really interesting fund that invested in the cidery. And so she came to me and said, hey, I think you might be interested in this company.
Okay.
So I looked it up, and I was really interested because they're really trying to preserve the diversity of apple varieties.
Okay.
So, I mean, you may already know this, but, the apples that go into market for eating are not necessarily the best ones that will make cider,
right.
And vice versa.
Right.
And so they are super committed to preserving many varieties of apples that won't go for just pure eating.
Right.
And they're making wonderful cider out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Also, they've got a network of orchards where they're really trying to practice regenerative practices as much as possible. So I think the combination of those two things really made it interesting for us.
Gotcha.
But I will say also, I was very influenced by a comment that Kelly, our vineyard manager, made early on when I started doing this work, which he said, we're going to drink our way out of this problem. I thought, if we're going to drink our way out of this problem, I have to invest in something that we can drink.
That's great.
Yeah. I mean, they happen to be all the way in Vermont, but
right.
But what they're doing with orchardists out there is really special.
Well, brings up the question of, do you have a range or area of focus, or? Yeah.
We haven't. I think by nature, a lot of the stuff we do is in California just because we're here.
Yeah.
And we have a few clusters. So I have a little bit of a cluster going in Vermont, partially just because of my connection there. We do have a little bit of a cluster in Oregon. And then it's just sort of a smattering
Nice.
in other places.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Do you have any more stories like that, like in terms of investments that had unexpected outcomes and that were positive, hopefully, rather than negative, unexpected? They just absconded and they're now somewhere and you can't find them.
Yeah.
Positive stories, like anything else that...
Yeah, I mean, so there's a company, I mentioned grass-fed beef before. This is a grass-fed beef company. And, you know, regional grass-fed beef is a tough business model.
Oh.
And so in some ways, this investment was just sort of like, let's see if she can figure it out, right?
Okay.
And I think to an extent she has, although
Okay.
I think there's still more to figure out. And that's just something that we're constantly trying to, you know, go through R&D cycles around. But I think one of the things that is unexpected is the work that she's done with local ranchers. So she's what I call a producer aggregator, which means she has a home ranch where she raises cattle, but she aggregates from other cattle ranchers in her region. So she's got a network of like 6 to 8 other ranchers.
That she sells their meat.
So she buys their animals and then sells the meat under her brand.
Got it.
But she has done really amazing work with this group. And they're very diverse. So many of them are pretty conventional grain farmers who add cattle to their rotations. And she's always like, maybe try doing this. Like, maybe try leaving your cattle on the land for a little bit longer and we'll see how they finish. Or, you know, try adding this to your crop rotation. And so, you know, if you did a cover crop, you could, you know, have animals during this season. And, you know, they're just things like that where she's really worked with farmers who I would say, some of whom were pretty conventional, but have started down this path at her encouragement. And have really started digging into the regenerative principles and are like moving down the path of regeneration, which is so cool, to the point where she was like, hey, do you all want to do holistic management training? And everybody was like, yes. You know, and so it's just,
that's amazing.
It's the network effect on sort of the wider community of what she's doing, I think is huge. So, yeah, and that's something that I think on some level I knew she had the capability to do that, but I didn't have the foresight to think like, oh, that's going to be an outcome.
Right.
That's going to be an impact that we're going to really celebrate down the road. Yeah.
I think I was remembering what I forgot, which was I'd heard something about you in your next career want to be a sommelier.
That's so funny because I think I mentioned that to Elaine, who works here at the ranch and is Kelly's husband, and I think she mentioned it to Kelly, and now Kelly has this plan for my life.
That must be it.
Part of that was in response to hear some of our own sort of obstacles to trying to get regenerative natural wine on the menu here at the commercial kitchen.
Yeah.
So I think
what are those obstacles?
Well, I think it was just sort of, you know, it's a little bit more difficult supply chain to try to get those versus, you know, just finding somebody who is like either hyper local to us or through other channels where it's maybe more conventional. And so, you know, and then we're also dealing with small batches sometimes. And so, you know, sometimes it's just hard to keep things regularly in stock like you want them to. It's the same challenge with, you know, folks like, you know, Google trying to source their stuff from small farmers. I mean, it's inconsistent. Like sometimes the timing's not right. And then like, you know, ordering in small batches versus like just ordering like, you know, a pallet of broccoli. So, I think there's just some logistical challenges that are pretty basic.
Yeah.
But I joked that I would go and train and become a sommelier and come back to the ranch so that I could pick the wine and serve it here.
Right.
So that was mostly a joke. But I think Kelly's hoping one day that'll actually happen.
Well, from your experience, are there business structures or ideas or setups that are what are the most successful ones? What have you seen that's worked? If somebody's in an agricultural space, and they're open, do you have any suggestions? Do you have any advice?
I would say that stacking enterprises is really key in this day and age.
Oh, so give an example.
Yeah. So, the vineyard here is an example. So we're growing grapes, but we're also grazing sheep there. And then we sell the sheep for meat. Right. So you have a vineyard enterprise and stacked with a livestock enterprise. Right. Diversification, but also how can you get the most out of this acreage? Right. If you can have 2 products instead of just one.
Right.
Or even if you can have 3, what if you follow it with chickens after the sheep go through? Right. So that would be another one. Right. Yeah. So if you can think about
can we follow that with chickens?
I think you can.
No, I think we can. I know we can. I think that would be fantastic. I'm asking for permission rather than. That would be fantastic.
Yeah. So that's what I mean by a stacked operation. And even here at the ranch, we have events and we have the whole hospitality thing. That's another stacked operation. Right. And so I think that just pure farming these days, single sort of product farming, is it's so hard today to really make a living doing that. Right. The margins are thin; they're getting thinner, and you can't control sort of where the market pricing goes sometimes. And so, to the extent that you can have more diversity in your operation and more diversity in the products that you can offer, you can stabilize some of that and make more profit on the same amount of acreage, right? So I think that that's increasingly becoming the key.
Okay. Anything people should avoid in terms of approaches or products or anything?
I would say, generally, when people are thinking about stacking operations or trying to venture into new kinds of business, my question is always, who's going to do that?
Yeah.
If you're already farming full time and then you want to run an Airbnb business, are you going to do both of those? Because that's actually 2 jobs.
Right.
And then you might end up doing both of those poorly. Right. In the pursuit of doing both. And so it's always a question of, human capacity, right? So A, do you have the expertise to do that?
Right.
And then B, do you actually have the time and resources to do that yourself? Or does it make sense to hire somebody to do that?
Right.
And if so, does that make economic sense for that business? So it's questions like that I wouldn't say there's any hard and fast rule about do's and don'ts, but it's just sort of what's in your wheelhouse of expertise and capacity?
Yeah, isn't that a difficulty? That's the flip side of stacking enterprises too, right?
It is.
Which is you've just added a whole lot of complexity and time to your life.
Right, and a
farming.
lot of crop farmers and perennial farmers, they're not livestock people. Right. So they're just I don't want to deal with a bunch of sheep. Why would I do that?
Right.
So I think, that's often a challenge too.
Yeah. Do you have any resources that can transition somebody from ideas about what they want to sobering them up and making it actually a viable business? In farming specifically.
Do I have any tools for them to make that transition?
Resources, yes. Any sobering thoughts to just smack us upside the head so we don't...
spreadsheet will usually sober people up pretty quick.
Okay, good. In what sense? Can you break that down? What do you do with somebody who comes in? Do you sit them down and
Yeah, we go over the numbers and
Okay.
it's just sort of like, is this realistic?
That's usually where you're like,
Yeah.
no, it's not.
And, oftentimes it's just asking the question. So as opposed to saying, this is a deficiency or you don't have enough in this or things like that, it's usually just like I try to just ask questions.
Yeah.
So how do you think that's going to happen?
Right.
How much capacity do you really have to devote to this?
Right.
Who's going to pay for that? Those kinds of questions
Yeah.
where then it's sort of the self-realization of like, oh, maybe I'm biting off more than I can chew.
Right.
One of the things that I have told some of my investees is tying two sinking boats together does not make a floating ship. Right? Because it's like, oh, I've got this sinking boat over here, and so what am I going to do? I'm going to try to build another one. Right? To like stabilize the thing. But like when you're building it, it's probably half sinking also.
That's right.
So if you're tying those two together, it's not going to automatically make a floating boat, right? Actually, what you're going to get is two sinking boats.
Which is even worse. Yeah.
So that is a general piece of advice that I often will just sort of put out there to make people think.
Yeah, that's good. Is sales a place that you see people having problems? Like people have this great vision for a farm, blah blah blah, and then you're sort of like, and where will you sell that meat, or where will you sell those grapes? Is that a common theme? I'm just curious because it feels to me like it would be. But.
Yeah, so I would say that whenever you're talking about helping small farmers in any region, one of the key questions is access to markets.
Right.
So that's always a question.
Okay.
I will say that in the work that I do with my borrowers and investees, usually they know what their markets are already, and
Great.
they have access to those markets.
Because you're looking for somebody that already has some sales, so
Exactly.
they've gotten a sense.
So they know
of
where
what's
they're going with it. I think, sometimes farmers will have these idealistic visions of, well, I'm going to sell direct to consumer, right? That's a huge new trend now. Like instead of selling to the wholesale or to the, to restaurants or grocery stores, like I'm going to sell direct to consumer.
Right.
Great. Well, how are you going to do that?
Right.
Like who's going to run your website? Who's going to process all of the transactions on your website?
Right.
Who's going to do fulfillment? Who's going to market? Who's going to send the newsletter every week to your customers? And so it's just questions like that where it's like, I don't think there's this idea that, we can capture more margin if we go direct to consumer. And yet I think the lack of realization around what it takes to actually do that can be a stumbling block. And so sometimes it's the reality check around
Yeah,
that.
it sounds like the way you just described it, realistically, sure, you may make a better margin, but you also might need to hire some people to help out.
Right, like who's going to do the deliveries?
Your time will be a lot higher, which is also a bigger cost,
Right.
in that business.
Right. So that margin you make, that extra margin you make, you might actually be eating up with operational costs to fuel that side of the business.
Yeah, I think I will have released the episode I'm about to reference before I release this one, so I can say this, but I just interviewed one of our winemakers for the ranch, and she's talking about she opened a tasting room, which is often seen as like a great way to boost sales and get direct access to the market, to consumers. And she's finding out that it's costing her $10,000 a month to run that tasting room. And she's like, if I'd known, I wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
And she could make it cost less if she worked there every day. But if she wants to run it like a business, it's $10,000 a month.
That's right.
Yeah, and so like big.
Well, she's got a whole other winemaking business to run. So
Right. Yeah, so really important, really important thing to think about. That's great.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd suggest people read, or, are there resources in that sense in terms of just like how, I don't know, maybe how you learned or how you got to that point in your life where you felt confident thinking about these investments, and it was not like, anyway, you get the point.
I think One of the interesting things about being in lending and investing is actually experience trumps anything that you can read in a book. So you can read as much as you want, but the biggest and deepest learnings are when you've actually experienced a situation. So, you'll go through something and you'll be like, oh, I'll never do that again.
Right.
Right? And, you can read that in a book, but it's not really going to sink in until you've experienced it. And I think it's just one of those industries where experience is really key, actually. So just, being able to see and process a number of transactions, being able to sort of live through the experience of, how that investment sort of played out over time, that kind of thing. How it might have gone bad, what could you have looked for before so that wouldn't have happened. Right. Those life experiences, I think, are really what make you good at what you do in this industry. So I think it's a little bit unique in that sense.
My thought from you saying that is, then a good piece of advice would be to start small, like have the ability to fail without
sacrificing too much.
Get that experience as cheaply as possible, basically. Was that a fair guess?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Good. Well, great. Is there? I mean, this is a podcast with people who are interested in doing farming. Do you? I should have told you that beforehand, because now.
Who are we talking to again? Yeah.
You might be everyone's favorite person on this podcast. Do you want people to be able to be in touch with you who would be interested in seeking investments or anything like that? If there's anybody out there, is there a place you want people to go to in terms of a website, or is there contact that you want people to have to be able to?
Yeah. Gosh, that's a good question. So usually the ones that I pay the most attention to come through some kind of a referral network.
Okay. Gotcha.
So I would say that if people do want to be directly in touch about something, it's good if they mention this podcast.
Okay. Gotcha.
Because I think sometimes just having a blind inquiry come in, it's hard to feel grounded in who they are, what they do. I mean, it's not like it's never happened, but I would just say the strongest sort of candidates for our attention usually come through some kind of referral network. So,
fantastic. Anything else that you think is important for people to think about or know?
Yeah, I would just say that the way that we do investing and our style and what we look for is pretty unique.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And so I think it's funny because people hear what we have to say, but then get super disappointed when they go try to find somebody else that does this.
Right.
So it is fairly unique, but I also think that we're committed to being transparent about what we do so that other folks can hopefully replicate the kind of investing that we do. And we're really trying to encourage other folks to think differently about their investing, where they're deprioritizing return. Where they're really hopefully making some priority around soil health principles, around farming.
Yeah.
It's so missing in our sector, and so these are the things that are important to us, and we hope that they'll be important to other folks out there. So we do these things. I'm actually here on the ranch for a learning journey with other investors.
I love your name tag. I have not forgotten your name this whole interview.
But we regularly do things like this to hopefully help influence the field of investors and philanthropists to do things in a way that really match the regenerative principles that we're practicing on the land in the way that they do investing in philanthropy, and to prioritize those things. And to think differently about, the desire for impact metrics or the desire for financial return. I think sometimes investors get stuck in that way of thinking because that's basically what the zeitgeist is.
Yeah.
Like that's what the investor community is telling them that they should be looking for. And so they don't question it and they just go down this path. And so I think one of the best things that we can do is help people question.
That's great.
Yeah. Why do you actually need that?
Yeah. that's great.
Right?
Yeah.
And maybe think differently about how you're interacting with folks and what's benefiting you versus what's benefiting them.
When you say, why do you actually need that? Who are you talking? Who are you asking that?
Investors.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Why do you need
Why
that?
do you need a 10% return?
Right.
Why do you need a market rate return?
Right.
Like you have excess wealth to invest in these companies.
Great point.
Right?
Great point.
And so I think there's some existential questioning that needs to happen, right? Because I think a lot of times impact metrics, they're hidden behind this veil of like, well, we have to know what we did had an impact. Like, how will we know?
Right.
Well, shoot, if you're in relationship with these people, you'll know. Right?
Right.
Oftentimes, impact metrics are used to just make oneself look good. Right? It's very self-serving in a lot of ways. And so why do you actually need that? Well, my investors are looking for it. Well, what would happen if your investors were actually in relationship with the folks that you invested in? Would they need a number? Or would they be able to tell what was happening?
Right.
Because they've been there, they've visited that farm or that enterprise, and they've seen what the impact is, And so, like, one of the things that I always say is it's lack of relationship that wants a number.
Yeah.
And so, what if we can actually really prioritize the relationship piece of it, so that we can fully understand from not just a cerebral perspective, but just from a whole body, I guess, spiritual experience of what's actually happening out on the land.
Wow.
Yeah.
You mentioned spiritual experience twice now for an investor. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Tell me, like, how does that come into, like, tell me more.
Yeah. I think that we live in a society where we really prioritize things that we can see, touch, and like analyze with our brains, right? But there's, as working in ag, there are a lot of factors that don't have any explanation, right? A lot of things happen without explanation. And I think that there's a sense of mystery in the world that we've discounted because of our prioritization of, numbers, metrics, science, all of these things. Like, if you can't prove it with science, then it can't be true, or it doesn't exist, which we know is not true. And actually, there's a whole field called quantum physics to describe the things that we can't explain. And so if science can legitimize this field, why can't we?
Yeah.
Right? So I feel like we have really de-emphasized our own human connection to nature and to each other, and we're not in tune with the wisdom that lives in our bodies, separate from the wisdom that lives in our brains. Right? We have wisdom in our hearts and in our guts, and we know that because we have visceral reactions to things, right? It's because your body has wisdom in it. And so for me, that is the spiritual piece, right? Like, I can know things and I can understand things and I can process things that don't have to be in my head, right? And so some people call that spiritual, some people call that magic. We call it all of those things.
That's great.
Yeah.
How does that factor into what you do? Or is it more just something that you pay attention to? It doesn't necessarily become a factor, but it's like an awareness.
It's both.
Okay.
So, if I can look at a business and look at it on paper, and it can look just fine. This all looks, normal, whatever. But in talking to an entrepreneur, if I just feel off, I'm actually not going to do that investment. Yeah. And, how do you tell somebody that?
Yeah.
Like, we didn't do it because I felt off. I had a stomach ache that day. But that's a real thing.
Yeah.
And I have seen that played out where I overrode my gut feeling.
Yeah.
Because the rational side of my brain was like, everything checks out on paper.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be an investment that was really hard for us because it went bad. Oof. Because I was right in my gut, and I didn't pay attention to it.
Right.
So it's about sometimes making that decision based on that last factor. And there have been times too where even in discussing with Sally some of the investments that, I'm lining up, if she just says she doesn't feel right about something, with no sort of like scientific or rational explanation for why, she just feels like something not right about it, we just won't do it.
Yeah.
Just like, great, let's just leave that one. We don't have to do it. So there are times like that where it does affect our decision making.
Wow. You see differently in this world, and are there any more of those? Feel free to opine.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that my sort of my list of rants, if you will.
Yeah.
One is about embracing magic.
Okay. I love that.
Yeah. And then another one is about the impact metrics, which I talked about.
Yeah.
And about not really relying on those too much. In fact, for the most part, we shun them.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Yeah.
And another one is about return, which we also talked about. Right. So there's just this existential question about like, what is this investment really for?
Right.
Like, is it for me to continue to contribute to my own wealth as an investor? Like, is that really what we're talking about? Because if so, like, what kind of society are we actually going for?
Have you answered that question? What is it for? Do you guys have an operating answer that you operate on?
So for us, I mean, our return objective is primarily return of capital.
Okay.
Because if capital can be returned to us,
capital, but not necessarily with
additional return. If it comes with additional return, great. Okay. But we're not like it must come with a 6%. We don't do that. And so if capital is returned to us, then we can redeploy it.
Right.
Right. So it's just the principle of circulation that we're really looking for.
Oh.
And then return is a bonus.
Right.
Yeah.
Have you ever read Sacred Economics?
I haven't read that one.
Oh, you got to read that.
Yeah.
Because obviously, like, you might jive with it in a lot of ways, but he talks about, like, having a negative interest rate and how that would increase circulation, how, like, we would want to get this out there because if you hold on to it, it's going down.
That's right.
So keep it in circulation. So that's really interesting.
Well, and so part of the just sort of framing of that is that, if you look at our economy, we have been on a really serious growth curve, right?
Yeah.
And so who has benefited the most from this growth curve? It's the financial industry.
Right.
And so we have seen financial capital just increasing at this like hockey stick, accelerated rate. And so it's easy to see that because there's numbers attached to that.
Right.
But the thing that we don't see is that what we've been depleting is natural capital and human capital. Right? So it's been at the cost of the land, and it's been at the cost of the labor force.
Right.
And so actually, if you want to make that pictorially, those two types of capital have actually been declining.
Right.
So almost in mirror to the financial capital, right? So if you just think about that in a picture, financial capital going up like a hockey stick, and then the other two types of capital decreasing at the same rate below that. And so there is a case to be made, I think, that if you're going to try to bring those things back into balance, there needs to be a correction. And in some cases, there might need to be an overcorrection where you're actually taking a negative return in favor for, sort of restoring natural and human capital. Right? So I think that there are times where we've invested thinking, oh, this is going to be a negative return for us.
Right.
But the impact is so important that we'll still make the investment.
Right.
So I think that's just not a mentality that investors often have. And so questioning the whole paradigm of what are we actually trying to go for, right? Yeah. Because a society where you prioritize financial over human and natural, that's a risky society.
To say the least.
You're creating a whole level of risk that you never imagined, right? You're creating societal risk. Right. You're creating existential risk. Exactly. And so I think that's not factored in. right? And so that's also part of the play around like why we're not really return focused, because the moment we are, the moment we're putting ourselves at risk.
Right.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I think we should end with that.
Okay.
That's so good.
Great.
Thank you so much, Esther.
Yeah. No, it was fun.
Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I want to thank all of you who support this podcast through donations, Patreon subscriptions, sponsorships, or just posting a great review and telling a friend. You make this podcast possible, and I'm honored and humbled and inspired by your support. If you'd like to support this podcast, you'll find links to all the ways you can support it in the show notes. Now let me send you off with a bit of beauty and enchantment in the form of a recording I made one night on the banks of the San Benito River here deep in the heart of Piscinas Ranch. I'm incredibly grateful to Colden Pro, the person who let this song pour from his very musical soul through a guitar into the night air as we celebrated the 21st birthday of Hannah Carrick, who momentarily added her voice to the music at one point. A special thanks to Bob Dylan for writing this beautiful music, to the moon and stars who provided lighting, to the crickets and the San Benito River who provided atmospheric accompaniment, and to the wine that brought us all together. I hope you enjoy this magical moment as much as I did.